Hello, it's James in Glasgow.
And it's Chris at Westminster.
It's Caitriona in Washington.
And it's Faisal in the Newscast studio.
Hello, everyone. Now, over the weekend on Newscast, Paddy and Laura were talking about this ultimatum that President Trump had issued to Iran, threatening to obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first, ! Unless they reopen the Strait of Hormuz, this crucial choke point for about a fifth of the world's oil and gas. Caitriona, just let's do this one step at a time. When was that original deadline supposed to expire? How long was it for?
So the original deadline was for 48 hours, essentially. So that would run out very late tonight, whether you're in the East Coast US or UK time. So technically that original deadline still had many hours to run on it before President Trump's latest intervention.
And Chris, was the UK taking that threat seriously? Because it did seem to be a threat of a very significant escalation, and potentially an escalation that would hit a lot of civilians in Iran. And then Iran said that if that happened, its response would be to hit desalination plants and other targets around the Gulf, which millions of people depend on, frankly, to keep them alive, to have water throughout the Gulf. So was the UK worried about this? Did they think that this was all going to spiral out of control?
Absolutely, there was worry, but there was also, as I mentioned a second ago, an awareness in government that the Prime Minister talked about on Monday afternoon when he was talking to MPs on the liaison committee of senior select committee chairmen and women, that the UK did know that these talks between the US and Iran were happening. But I think, when I speak to people, James, in government privately, they acknowledge just the kind of the fundamental reality of dealing with a Trump White House, which is that half the time they're guessing, just like the rest of us, about what they might do next. So, of course, it makes sense to take seriously any deadlines that this president sets. But there's also an awareness that you may get to a point before that deadline where the script is then rewritten again. But then that's not to say it might not be rewritten once again 24 hours later. And so the Prime Minister is pretty candid when he's asked about, the implications, whether in the very short term, hours ahead, the kind of medium term of days or weeks, the longer term of months and beyond, when it comes to all of the questions that spiral from this conflict, and effectively acknowledges he doesn't know.
Yeah, and then, to exactly what you're saying, we get this post out of nowhere on President Trump's platform Truth Social. Let's just quote a bit of it. One of the all capitals posts. I am pleased to report that the United States of America and the country of Iran have had, over the last 2 days, very good and productive conversations. And the president goes on in his message, based on the tenor and tone of these in-depth, detailed and constructive conversations, which will continue. He says he has instructed the Department of War to postpone any and all military strikes. And he talks about those being against the Iranian power plants, the energy infrastructure, for a 5-day period, subject to the success of the ongoing meetings and discussions. So then, of course, Caitriona, there's a whole load of debate, as there always is with these messages out of the blue from President Trump, completely shaking everything up yet again. What is this a signal? Is it a temporary reprieve? Is it the wind down towards the end of war? How will Iran respond? I mean, what was your assessment? How are people reading it there in Washington, D.C.?
Here, people are scrambling to find out just what is going on and whether, in fact, there were talks or not, because shortly after the president posted that, and it was around about 7 a.m. in the morning here, so before the markets opened, crucially, the Iranians then came out and said, well, we weren't having any talks. We don't know what the president is talking about there. So were there talks? Were there not talks? We're sort of clueless about that at the moment. And the president has spoken a few times today, and he's said this time and again about these great discussions that they're having with the Iranians. And we just keep getting remarks from the Iranians saying they're not having any direct talks or any negotiations or any discussions. They said they did receive calls from some sort of friendly intermediate countries asking them to have talks with the US, but that hadn't happened yet. So it's curious as to whether the president was sort of giving this information to try and regulate the markets a little bit, which, have had a fairly rough time of it over the last few weeks. Is it that he's sort of leading up to this position he laid the groundwork for last week of being prepared to declare victory from a US perspective? They've had great military successes in their campaign in Iran so far. Their strategy points, well, that's been less successful so far. It's possible that what the president is talking about, these talks that the Iranians say aren't happening, that, there is a tradition there of both countries maybe doing a bit of in the media diplomacy and trying to force issues. So, us mere mortals aren't privy fully to what's going on behind the scenes. But I suspect this isn't the last we've heard, even just today, from President Trump talking about this, because he is due to have a few more engagements later on.
Yeah, I also think it presumes, a lot of the world's assessment of this presumes that there's some sort of unified Iranian regime at the moment and that it isn't fragmented. I mean, one part of the regime might well say there are no talks, they might not know about them. There might be talks with another part. Does that part have the authority? I mean, there's a whole lot of questions. But to come back to pick up on your point about markets, Caitriona, with Faisal, I mean, Faisal, maybe take us back to, first of all, how did the markets respond to the initial deadline? And then how did they respond? Yet another roller coaster and not just the markets. I mean, we've got various things, don't we? The oil price, we've got shares, we've got government borrowing, government lending, rather, the bond markets.
I struggle to remember such an across the board wild ride as we've had today. And you have crashes sometimes, but this was quite an extraordinary series of events. So you're absolutely right to remind everybody that the first thing this morning, we had the reaction to what you were talking about over the weekend, which was the escalation, the threats, desalination plants versus energy infrastructure, as escalatory as you could possibly imagine on both sides. And the markets reacted. Stock markets in Asia fell. The oil price went up to $3 or $4 a barrel. And as you mentioned, and this is really important, this is the effective interest rate on government debts also shot up, including for the UK, the so-called gilt rate, all the way up to 5.12%. And, we thought problematic when it goes over 5. So it was going higher and higher and higher. Then bang, up comes this Truth Social post that you've just described. And it just kind of hugely rebounded, went into reverse. And let me just pick on the oil price, for example. That fell 14%. Within seconds, essentially. But then when Iran denied, it was back up 10%, and then it's moved more than 5% up or down another 4 times today.
Oh my goodness.
Same on gas. You can imagine, I'm sort of drawing out the chart here. Same for gas. And then, is really interesting in terms of the effect on us here in the UK, was what we call the gilt yield, the effective cost of government borrowing. And essentially, to cut a long story short, that is a verdict on how inflationary the wave from the Gulf, which will eventually hit us, how that will be, and therefore the requirement for the Bank of England, for example, to raise interest rates to combat this wave of inflation domestically. And at one point, there was the assumption that interest rates, and remember, just a few weeks ago, before the conflict, the assumption would have been that there was going to be a cut or two. At one point this morning, before the Trump post, 4 rate rises was what was being assumed by the markets. That's down to sort of 2.5, 3 now. So still, and so that sort of gives you the sense of where we are, which is essentially this, which is, so the markets have rebounded, they bounced back in the other direction, and they're now still better than they were, but they're worse, obviously, than they were before the conflict started, which shows, I think, the market's confused, as all of us are, confused as diplomats, but starting to assume that you have to plan for this not lasting weeks, but lasting months.
So I suppose the really big question here, Chris, is why has Donald Trump made this change? And has he been bounced into it by the markets? Has he looked at what's happening to the economy and decided, I better retreat a bit here from these really, really, really loud threats?
Well, you begin to wonder, don't you? And Caitriona, I'd be fascinated about your take on this. The combination of various things. One, there's the markets. One, there's how things are going down amongst America's usual allies. And then there's American public opinion and a public opinion within and amongst those who backed Donald Trump for the presidency in a campaign where he was emphasising, the sort of futility of foreign conflict, as he often articulated it, and America not getting drawn into such things. So, where we divine the sort of proportional significance to attach to each of those, I think is an interesting question. But then also, where do things go next if there are twists in the coming hours and days that he's not anticipating, and how does he respond to those? And then from the government at Westminster's perspective, and indeed, Western governments beyond America as well, how do they go about anticipating what might come next, making contingency plans? This was the subject of the Cobra Contingencies Committee meeting that was happening in Westminster on Monday evening, involving the Bank of England governor and plenty of cabinet ministers. How do they begin to imagine the scenarios that they might be confronted with, both in the sort of short and medium term? How do they wrestle with what might be affordable, given the scale of government intervention in recent years, with other energy shocks that there have been, and indeed the pandemic into the mix too, alongside the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia? All of these things swirl with that big picture question of the longevity of the conflict, which kind of underpins so many of the subsequent questions about how long the implications of this go on. All of those are still, impossible for those in government here to answer, because they can't be certain, or to put it another way, have no idea what Donald Trump might do next.
We do know that he's motivated by money and he's motivated by the markets, right? We saw that with the tariffs last year in the wake of Liberation Day. As soon as there was a nervousness around Treasury bills, he stepped in and took action. Here we see, as Faisal so eloquently articulated there, the chaos on the markets. If you look at the price of petrol at the pumps here in the US, which was the one big win that President Trump had out of his first year in office, that he was able to say he had brought down the price of petrol, or price of gas, as they say here. The price of petrol just in the last month since this war began has gone up by $1 a gallon, and the price of diesel has gone up by $1.50 a gallon. So if you're going in to fill up your car, your van or whatever, that's a level of an increase that you really, really, really notice in your wallet. And so people are now starting to push back to their local representatives about what is this all about. We had a poll from CBS YouGov over the weekend, and more than 90% of people had said they'd noticed the price of petrol going up. And they're very unhappy about that, because obviously we have a cost of living crisis here and an affordability crisis that we've been talking about since before the presidential election in 2024. And we know what a key indicator that was. So I think you have those two factors pushing on President Trump and the team around him. Then the other kind of factor you have pushing again is how the allies are responding, as you've just been talking about there as well, and the sense that the US is quite isolated here with Israel, and there is a cleave in their sort of two objectives from this war as well. We heard all those points of President Trump kind of seeming to suggest the job was done. We have a statement out from Prime Minister Netanyahu today. He's been speaking to President Trump. This statement just came in actually since we started recording the pod here. But in that, Prime Minister Netanyahu speaking about his conversation about President Trump, and how he believes there is an opportunity to leverage the tremendous achievements, as he's put it, that we've reached alongside the US to realise the goals of the war through an agreement that will safeguard our vital interests. So he's talking about an agreement. We're not hearing anything about an agreement elsewhere, just this conversation about talks, as we were discussing a few moments ago. But the Israeli Prime Minister continues to say, at the same time, we are continuing to strike in both Iran and Lebanon. We are smashing the missile program and the nuclear program. We continue to deal severe blows to Hezbollah. Just a few days ago, we eliminated 2 more nuclear scientists, and we are still active. We will safeguard our vital interests under all circumstances. So no suggestion from Prime Minister Netanyahu that his campaign is getting anywhere near an end either. So there is this sense that the president is now torn between sort of international pressure, if you like, and domestic and financial pressure as well.
Yeah, and actually, as you say, strikes have actually continued. It's not as if there's a pause here. I mean, the military action has continued throughout the day. And I actually want to come on to that point that we've all sort of nudged at and hinted at, which is a bit more about how this might affect newscasters, especially here in the UK. But before that, let's just clear something up about these talks, Chris, because we actually have heard from the Prime Minister addressing MPs at this liaison committee meeting, which is a meeting of some senior MPs, basically, who chair various committees around Westminster. You can tell us a bit more about that in a minute. But let's hear the Prime Minister, first of all, because he said he actually was aware, to some degree, at least, of talks between Washington and Tehran.
I welcome the talks reported between the US and Iran. And to be clear with the committee, we, the UK, were aware that was happening. And the immediate priority has to be a swift resolution of the conflict and delivering a negotiated agreement which puts tough conditions on Iran, particularly in relation to nuclear weapons.
And so, Chris, we've heard reports of UK officials actually being present at talks between Iran and the US in the past. Are we reading too much into this to think that the UK has any diplomatic involvement here other than being briefed? I mean, again, it's sort of more questions than answers from what the Prime Minister is saying there, because, again, we don't really know talks with whom, at what level, about what. You know, it's so frustratingly vague, unless you can shed total light on it all.
Sure. I mean, certainly what I took away from it, as we were pondering a little earlier, was just the recognition from the Prime Minister and a desire to volunteer publicly that when it was news to us that these talks, whatever they amounted to, were happening, it was not news to him. So in the context of all of the barbs that the President's been throwing in the Prime Minister's direction publicly, etc., a nod from the Prime Minister that underneath that remains a functioning diplomatic relationship where the UK is briefed on things that are not yet in the public domain. So I think it was a desire, a noted desire, I thought, from the Prime Minister to volunteer that, alongside, by the way, him saying, when he was asked about the whole nature of these barbs lobbed in his direction, that in his view he knows what's going on there. This is the President putting pressure on him publicly, and in the view of the Prime Minister, he'll remain sort of resolute in what he has articulated as his sense of what's in the British national interest, which is to take a markedly different approach from the White House.
Yeah, and the Prime Minister was actually asked, Faisal, about cost of living pressures at this liaison committee meeting. Can you tell us a bit more about, and I'm sure lots of newscasters will be very interested to hear your take on, what does this mean for newscasters? What does this mean for us all?
Well, the unhelpful answer, just to preface everything, is it depends, obviously. And
well, that's totally fair.
And we've heard about the volatility in markets, and obviously that directly feeds through to the gas and the oil price, which then feeds through into the petrol, and the eventually from July would feed through into domestic energy prices. It should be said that there's other things going on in this Cobra meeting, and actually we should step back and say it's quite unusual for a sort of preemptive economic Cobra meeting like this to happen. So that's the first thing I'd say. I would have expected it more around the issue of critical supply chains, the petrol supply, which he said that there was no problem with. Perhaps things that are less well known, like the supply of fertilizers, which comes from urea, which is disproportionately a byproduct of what is refined in the Gulf. Things like helium, which matters hugely for the tech industry because you need helium to make microchips. There's all sorts of other sort of unknown little quarries of the world economy that are dependent on that blockage in the Straits of Hormuz that I frankly didn't even know about before it started to happen. But if we take that critical factor of the domestic fuel prices and the impact of gas and oil prices on that, the sense I get from talking to government, and I've spoken to the Chancellor, I've spoken to the Governor of the Bank of England, I've spoken to some of the energy bosses over the past week, is that there is time here. There is time both to establish what the problem is, how long-lived this conflict is, but you also have 3 months before the energy cap resets. And right now, the expectation is that energy cap will increase a typical household dual fuel bill to about $19.50. Remember that the energy price guarantee from 4 years ago kicked in at $2,500. So you still got a bit of a way to go. it has been dramatic in markets. It isn't quite the dizzy heights of the gas price that we saw during Russia-Ukraine. Nonetheless, I think the interesting thing here, and we spoke about this on Newscast a couple of days ago with Chris, is the preemptive need from across politics for some sort of package to be prepared in advance of it even necessarily being hugely needed. So if it's needed, I think we can say is, and then this also reflects back onto what I was talking about in terms of government bond yields, that is also maybe a little raised eyebrow about an open-ended fiscal commitment of tens of billions. The markets are saying you might want to think about whether you want to offer such open-ended commitments. So all the vibes, all the mood music I've had from the Chancellor and other people is, if something's being prepared, they really want to make it targeted. And instead of the tens of billions, I think you're talking a few billion. And indeed, the thing we have had, which is heating oil, whilst important, at 50 million is relatively modest and highly targeted on the very poorest. So they're waiting for certainty, and they're waiting to come up with some sort of, I think, package that could provide support in a targeted way. Now, if things do escalate and oil goes to $150, maybe they have to rethink that. How they'll afford that, though, is a real question. And the last thing I'll leave it to is how the politics and economics are intertwined. The energy price cap will get announced in May, I think in the days after the aftermath of the Labour, the local election results and possible action. Chris will know more about this in terms of Labour leadership. And you can imagine a dynamic here. I just float this, where the two things interact. And if there are some leadership noises, let's just call them that, are they going to be on the left, suggesting that bond yields don't matter, suggesting that fiscal rules don't matter, suggesting that, tens of billions is fine? You can start to see something as the key staging post in May on this quite complicated, interlinked journey between geopolitics, economics, and domestic politics.
Yeah, and that economic and political tightrope is what the Prime Minister and the Chancellor find themselves walking down right now. And throwing into the mix in the very short term is the sense that they want to give off the impression that they are clearly treating this seriously and examining all the potential ramifications of where things might go. And that means doing the groundwork now about what might be feasible in terms of support that could be offered, what mechanisms might exist to work out where you draw the line, what frameworks are there, say, within the Department of Work and Pensions or elsewhere, that might make it easier to deliver targeted support. Clearly, in these situations, the easiest, in purely logistical terms, amount of support is a universal thing, because you don't have to work out where your cliff edges are and where somebody qualifies and where somebody doesn't. But all the mood music, publicly and privately, is an awareness that in all likelihood wouldn't be affordable, and so there's clearly a lot of stress testing going on about where those lines might be drawn. There's also an awareness around giving off a reassuring vibe, not wanting to see any sense of panic in the short term, particularly around, say, petrol and diesel. And then there's, as Faisal hints at, absolutely the politics. We saw that intervention from the former Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner last week, albeit in a different part of, if you like, the political woods around immigration policy, but absolutely the Prime Minister and Chancellor and others keenly aware of the argument that will no doubt gather a head of steam the other side of the elections in early May, with the likelihood now, as we approach late March, that these two things are going to overlap.
Caitriona, just before you go, this is a terrible question to ask you, really, but when do you think we'll next hear from President Trump? And I know that you can hear from him any second and any moment.
On
is there
demand.
anything?
Hold on.
I know.
Let me consult Mystic Meg. Get my
know,
ball
I'm
out.
sorry. But is there anything scheduled? Like, is he due to be in front of the media soon or again? Or, you never know. It's a stupid question. Never mind, it's a stupid question.
It's a great question.
No, it's not. It's not actually. And I will pull up his diary here if you bear with me 1 minute, because we've already heard from him 3 times today. As he's traveling around. Yeah, only 3. Well, it's only 3 p.m. or so in the afternoon here.
You just wonder how much
it's
pressure
still
he's under here as
early.
well, don't you? You wonder, while you're looking that up, how much pressure he's under domestically. But that's another question.
He's, I mean, as I was alluding to earlier, he is under massive pressure domestically here. You can't oversell just how little support there is here in America for what he's doing. Poll after poll comes out either saying completely opposed to the initial strikes and to carrying them on. And even from his most loyal supporters, vast majorities want it wrapped up immediately, declare victory and get out of there, even from the most ardent so-called MAGA supporters. And there is a little fraction within the MAGA base, but the people who are opposed to it within the MAGA base are very loud. So the polling isn't backing up what the podcasters are saying, if you like. But I was speaking to a whole pile of Republicans and MAGA people over the last week or so, and the kind of universal theme that was coming across was we're in favour of what he's doing in Iran, and in terms of, what is perceived to be or being described by the president as making America safer by making sure Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon. But what everyone is not in favour of is the methodology that the president has gone about, not having a big address to the nation, explaining to the country why he was going to war with another nation, and also how the timeline has slipped. Like that initial video in the middle of the night, early hours of the morning on that Saturday, talked about a multi-day operation. We're now heading for a month. There are more and more reinforcements, military reinforcements heading for the Gulf. They won't be there for a couple more weeks. It looks like when you speak to military strategists that this could be weeks or months more of an operation. You have the president, notwithstanding all his talk about a deal or no deal in the last few hours, saying just on Friday he wasn't interested in a ceasefire. So the mood music, coupled with the Prime Minister of Israel's determination to keep this going and keep striking, does sort of suggest something much longer. But I can tell you there are two more opportunities that we'll have today to hear from President Trump. He's in Memphis, Tennessee right now, and then he'll make his way back. So given how loquacious he's been so far, he may say more as the day is out. And the other bit of reporting, just to bring to you on that issue of talks or no talks, deal or no deal, is some of the outlets here in the US are reporting there may be talks later in the week in Pakistan, and that the Vice President J.D. Vance would be leading that US delegation to what would be at that point direct talks with Iran. Now, I'll just put a gigantic health warning on that we have not stood that up here at the BBC ourselves at this point, but many of the US media outlets are reporting rumblings in that direction. So we'll see what happens. But I mean, an hour is a long time in this in this sort of situation, let alone a few days.
I love
You can say that again.
I love the use of the word loquacious.
Me too. I was going to comment on that as well. Tremendous word.
I
And
love that
a
word.
very apt one. A good one. Listen, I know you have to go. Faisal, I know you have to go too. So, Caitriona, thank you very much.
You are so welcome. Talk soon.
Faisal, thank you very much as well.
Thank you.
Chris, there's another really important thing that we just need to talk about before you go, because the other thing that Sir Keir Starmer was asked about at the liaison committee meeting was this attack in North London, Golders Green, predominantly Jewish area, or I'll do that again. Because the other thing that Sir Keir Starmer was asked about at this liaison committee meeting was this attack in North London, in Golders Green, on 4 ambulances run by a Jewish volunteer medical charity. What more do we know about that? What did the Prime Minister have to say about it?
Yeah, the disgust we've heard articulated by political leaders here today is what you'd expect, really, waking up on Monday morning to this news of this arson attack on these Jewish charity-owned ambulances. It's being treated as an anti-Semitic hate crime. It's being investigated by counter-terror officers. That's what the Metropolitan Police are saying. So there was these 4 ambulances set on fire in the early hours of Monday. There were then several explosions caused by the gas canisters that are on board ambulances. And the Prime Minister articulating his horror, his disgust at what's happened. He said when he was talking to MPs that replacement ambulances are going to be provided pretty much straight away, and in time the NHS will fund the long-term replacement of these ambulances. And Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, talking about it being a dark day for London, and we've heard, as we have repeatedly, haven't we, in recent years, from Jewish community leaders, of that fear from so many Jews of the threat that they face, the fear that they face. We heard it after the attack in Greater Manchester at the synagogue there. You hear it in the context of this latest attack, and as I say, a concern expressed across politics, really, about just how grim this is, frankly.
Yes, Chris, thanks very much for bringing us up to date on that. Thank you for everything. Nice to talk to you.
Cheers.